Lucy always admired people who spoke English fluently. She would listen to them in cafes, on the subway, and in movies, amazed at how effortlessly words flowed from their mouths. But every time she tried to speak, she hesitated, searching for the right words, fearing she'd make mistakes. One day, she decided she had to change. She couldn't stay silent forever. Welcome to English Tone, where we make learning English fun and easy through stories. If you've ever struggled with speaking English confidently, this story is for you. Let's see how Lucy overcame her fear and learned to speak English well. Lucy had been studying English for years, but when it came to speaking, her mind would freeze. She had read countless textbooks, memorized long lists of vocabulary words, and even aced grammar exercises. Yet every time she opened her mouth to speak, doubt crept in like an uninvited guest. Her thoughts felt tangled, as if they had to travel through a maze before reaching her tongue. In her head, she thought in her native language first, forming sentences carefully. Then she translated each word, trying to get the structure right. But by the time she was ready to speak, the conversation had already moved on. It was exhausting. It felt like being in a race where everyone else had a head start, and no matter how fast she ran, she was always behind. At work, she often avoided speaking up during meetings, fearing she would mispronounce a word or say something incorrect. At restaurants, she would point at the menu instead of saying her order out loud. In social gatherings, she smiled and nodded but rarely contributed. It wasn't that she didn't know English, she did. But something was holding her back. One evening, Lucy sat in a coffee shop with her best friend, Madison. The place was bustling with life. People chatting, coffee machines hissing, soft jazz playing in the background. Madison was a confident English speaker. She had grown up in a bilingual home, switching between languages effortlessly. To Lucy, she made speaking English seem so easy, as natural as breathing. "Lucy, why don't you ever join the conversation?" Madison asked, sipping her cappuccino. Lucy stirred her tea, watching the steam rise. She hesitated, then sighed. "I know what I want to say, but I get stuck. I don't sound natural." Madison set down her cup and leaned in slightly. "That's because you're thinking too much. You need to train your brain to think in English." Lucy blinked. She had never thought about that before. Think in English? But how? "You're translating everything in your head, and that's slowing you down," Madison explained. "Native speakers don't stop to think about grammar rules or whether a word fits perfectly. They just speak. You have to start thinking in English first, without going through your native language." Lucy nodded slowly, but deep inside she wasn't sure if she could do it. Thinking in English sounded like an impossible task. Her mind had always worked in her native language. How could she reprogram it overnight? Madison noticed her hesitation. "Look, I get it. You've been trained to learn English the way most people are taught, through textbooks, grammar drills, and vocabulary lists. But real-life speaking doesn't work like that. When you were a kid, you didn't learn your first language by memorizing grammar rules, right? You listened, you imitated, and you just started speaking. It's the same with English. You have to stop worrying about mistakes and just talk." "But what if I say something wrong?" Lucy asked. "What if people laugh?" "People won't laugh, Lucy," Madison said reassuringly. "And even if they do, so what? Do you think native speakers never make mistakes? They do all the time, but they don't stop speaking because of it." Lucy looked down at her tea. She wanted to believe Madison, but the fear was deeply rooted. Every time she had tried speaking in the past, she had felt judged, even if no one had actually said anything negative. It was an internal battle, one that had been holding her back for years. Just then, a barista approached their table. "Hey, I just wanted to say I love your sweater," she said with a friendly smile. Lucy hesitated for a second before managing to say, "Oh, thank you so much." The barista nodded and walked away. It was a simple exchange, but Lucy's heart was racing. She had spoken without overthinking. Just a few words, but it felt like a small victory. Madison grinned. "See? You spoke without freezing." "Up!" Lucy laughed nervously. "Yeah, but that was easy. What if I have to say something longer?" "Then you keep practicing," Madison said. Let's try something. For the rest of this conversation, I want you to think only in English. No translating, just speak." Lucy's eyes widened. "Right now?" "Yes, right now," Madison said, smiling. "Come on, what's the worst that could happen?" Lucy hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Okay, I had a long day at work," she said slowly. Madison nodded. "Good. Keep going." "I was very tired. But I wanted, She trailed off, trying to find the right word. Madison waited patiently. "But you wanted what?" Lucy bit her lip. The word wasn't coming to her. Normally, she would have panicked, given up, or switched to her native language. But this time, she reminded herself of what Madison had said. "Just keep talking." "But I wanted to relax in a coffee shop," she finally said. "Yes, perfect!" Madison clapped her hands. "You see? You didn't have to be perfect. You just had to keep going." Lucy let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had done it. It wasn't smooth and she had hesitated, but she had spoken without stopping completely. It was a small step, but in that moment, she realized something important. She had been the one stopping herself all along. For the rest of the evening, Madison encouraged Lucy to speak as much as possible, helping her when she got stuck, but never interrupting her flow. It wasn't easy, but Lucy felt a change. The more she spoke, the more confident she felt. As they left the coffee shop, Madison said, "Tomorrow, let's take it a step further. I have an idea that will help you get even better at this." Lucy raised an eyebrow. "What idea?" "You'll see," Madison said with a playful smile. For the first time in a long time, Lucy felt excited about speaking English instead of afraid. Maybe, just maybe, she could finally break free from her fear. And she was ready to find out how. The next morning, Lucy woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. She had made a promise to herself the night before that today she would only think in English. No more translating her thoughts from her native language into English. It was time for a challenge, one that she knew would push her out of her comfort zone. She had always been afraid of making mistakes when speaking English, but today she was determined to overcome that fear. The decision felt a bit overwhelming at first. Her mind was so used to translating everything she wanted to say. "How can I possibly stop doing that?" she thought. But she knew that the only way to truly improve was to stop holding herself back. The first step was to stop overthinking, to stop the constant translation in her mind. It wasn't going to be easy, but Lucy was ready for the challenge. She spent the first few hours of the day practicing silently. As she was getting ready for the day, she forced herself to think in English. Simple thoughts like, "I need to brush my hair," or "I have to put on my shoes," were no longer allowed to be translated. They had to be in English from the start. She had to think directly in the language she was trying to master, but the more she tried to think in English, the more difficult it seemed. Her mind kept wanting to drift back into her native language. There were so many little words and phrases that didn't come to mind immediately in English, and that made her feel frustrated. Lucy knew she needed to push through it, so she kept at it. It felt strange, like walking in unfamiliar shoes, but she was determined to get better. Even though it felt like she was stuttering inside her mind, she kept moving forward. It was okay to make mistakes. She had to remind herself of that. Perfection was not the goal. Communication was. As long as she was able to convey what she wanted to say, that was enough for now. Around lunchtime, Lucy met her friend Madison at their favorite cafe. Normally, Lucy would have thought carefully about what to say before ordering. She'd mentally translate everything, even the simple request for a sandwich. But today was different. She decided to take the plunge. "I'm going to order in English," Lucy told herself. Madison sat down with a smile. "Are you ready for the challenge?" she asked, knowing exactly what Lucy was trying to do. Lucy nodded, her palms a little sweaty, but she was determined. It was time to stop being afraid. It was time to stop hesitating. She walked up to the counter, took a deep breath, and forced herself to speak in English. "Can I have a chicken sandwich and iced coffee, please?" she said, nervously trying to. Remember the correct way to order. The words came out slower than she expected, but they came out. The cashier smiled warmly. "Of course. That'll be $7.50. Lucy stood there for a moment, feeling a sense of relief. She had actually done it. She had spoken in English without overthinking it. It wasn't perfect. She stumbled over a few words and felt awkward at first. But she had communicated clearly, and that was what mattered. Madison had watched the entire exchange from the table. As soon as Lucy returned, she clapped her hands in excitement. "See? You did it!" she said, clearly impressed. "The key is to keep speaking even if you make mistakes. Don't worry about perfection. Just focus on communicating." Lucy felt a rush of happiness. She realized that Madison was right. The fear of making mistakes had always held her back, but today she had taken a step toward letting that fear go. Perfection wasn't necessary. Communication was. Her nerves began to fade away. It was like a switch had been flipped inside her mind. For the first time, she didn't feel as self-conscious about speaking English. The more she spoke, the easier it became. It was like a muscle. Once she started using it, the more fluent she became. As the afternoon went on, Lucy continued, practicing. She didn't stop after the lunch order. Every conversation she had with Madison, with the barista at the cafe, with the people on the street, it was all in English. Sure, there were moments of hesitation, moments where she had to think for a second before the right word came to her, but she didn't let that stop her. She kept speaking, even when it was hard. She began to realize that the more she used English, the more confident she felt. Later that evening, Lucy sat down with her notebook. She had set another small goal for herself, to write a few sentences in English about her day. She wanted to describe everything that had happened, even the small moments. Writing in English was something she often did, but she had always been careful about it. She feared making grammar mistakes, which was why she would take her time to write and rewrite her sentences until they sounded perfect. But today was different. She wasn't focusing on perfection. She was focusing on fluency. She started writing without stopping, allowing herself to make mistakes and not worry about them. As she wrote, she thought about the interactions she had during the day, the lunch order, the conversations with Madison. She realized that those moments had helped her grow. Lucy had stepped out of her comfort zone and faced her fear of speaking English. It wasn't easy, and it definitely wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Her writing became less forced, more natural. She could hear her thoughts in English now. The words were coming easier, not just when she was speaking, but in her mind as well. She wasn't translating anymore. Her brain was starting to think in English on its own. But Lucy wasn't done yet. She knew that this was just the beginning. Speaking without fear had given her a taste of what was possible. There was still a lot to learn, and Lucy was determined to keep improving. As the day came to an end, Lucy felt proud of herself. She had made significant progress. But there was still something more. She needed to practice in real-life situations, not just in her head. She had to keep pushing herself. The next step was to move beyond casual conversations and begin speaking in more challenging situations. She was ready to take that step, and she knew that the next time she was faced with a difficult conversation, she would be ready. Lucy's journey toward fluency was just getting started, and she was determined to keep moving forward. The fear was beginning to fade away, and her confidence was growing with each passing day. As Lucy prepared for the next day, she couldn't help but think about how much she had already accomplished. The next challenge was just around the corner, and Lucy was more than ready to face it head-on. She was no longer afraid to speak English, but now the real test awaited. Would she be able to handle more difficult situations, conversations, and ideas in English? That was something Lucy was eager to find out, and so her next goal was clear. She was ready to take her English skills to the next level. She had faced her fear of speaking, and now it was time to tackle fluency in real conversations, the next step toward mastering the language. That evening, after spending much of the day practicing speaking English with Madison, Lucy felt a sense of accomplishment. She had made small but significant progress, but she knew that real improvement would require more than just casual conversations. Lucy was determined to push herself further. She thought about the strategies Madison had mentioned, and one of them stood out: listening and repeating. She sat down at her desk and pulled out her phone. She remembered how Madison had spoken highly of podcasts as a tool for language learners. Lucy quickly found a podcast designed for English learners, one that spoke slowly and clearly with topics she was interested in. She pressed play, and the speaker's voice filled the room. The words were clear, but Lucy's first instinct was still to translate them into her native language before understanding them fully. However, as she listened more, she realized that this would take too much time and would hold her back from becoming fluent. Determined to improve, she decided to try something different. She would repeat the sentences out loud as soon as she heard them. Even if it felt awkward at first, she reminded herself that this was the only way to train her mouth and mind to speak naturally. She paused the podcast after each sentence and repeated it as closely as she could. It felt silly at first. She was talking to herself, mimicking a podcast host, and trying to get the rhythm just right. But Lucy wasn't discouraged. She knew this was an important step, and each time she repeated the sentence, she could hear the improvement in her pronunciation. It was subtle, but noticeable. The next day, Lucy decided to take this practice a step further. She had always enjoyed watching TV shows in English, but she hadn't considered them as tools for improving her language skills. That afternoon, she picked a show she had already seen a few times, thinking it would be easier for her to focus on the language rather than the plot. She chose a popular comedy show that had a lot of dialogue, with characters who spoke quickly and used casual language. Lucy knew it would challenge her, but that was exactly what she needed. As the show played, Lucy turned on the subtitles. The characters' conversations were fast, and some of the vocabulary was unfamiliar, but Lucy didn't let that stop her. She began pausing the show every time a character spoke. Instead of just reading the subtitles, she repeated the line out, loud in a way that mimicked the character's tone, rhythm, and pronunciation. She even tried to match the emotional expression in the character's voice, trying to make it sound as natural as possible. At first, she felt self-conscious. It felt awkward to pause and repeat lines, and sometimes she was unsure whether she was getting the tone right. But as she continued, something amazing happened. She started to notice subtle changes in her speaking style. Her pronunciation was becoming clearer, and she felt more confident in speaking English out loud. She began to recognize the rhythms of conversation, the pauses, the emphasis on certain words, the way speakers would stretch or shorten syllables to express themselves more naturally. It wasn't just about pronunciation anymore. Lucy was beginning to understand the flow of real conversations, and she could feel herself growing more comfortable with the language. The more she practiced, the less hesitant she felt when she spoke. Her speech was no longer forced or slow. Instead, her sentences came out more smoothly, and her words seemed to flow more easily. Lucy couldn't help but smile when she noticed the difference. Madison had mentioned that one of the keys to becoming fluent was speaking as naturally as possible, and now Lucy could see what that meant. It wasn't just about learning vocabulary or grammar. It was about learning to sound like a native speaker, to speak with the same rhythm and confidence that people used when they communicated in their own language. As the days went by, Lucy began to make small but noticeable changes in the way she thought. She started thinking in full English sentences, even when she was alone. Instead of thinking in her native language and then translating it into English, she began to think directly in English. For example, when she realized she needed to buy milk, she didn't first think, "I need to buy milk in her native tongue," and then translate it into English. Instead, she simply thought, "I need to buy milk," as if English was the natural way to express herself. This change, small as it may seem, was significant. It showed that her mind was gradually adapting to the language, shifting away from the old habit of translation. This shift in thinking wasn't always easy. Sometimes Lucy would catch herself slipping back into her old habits, thinking in her native language first and translating into English afterward. But with every attempt, she became more comfortable and more confident. She started using English in more situations, like when she was running errands or talking to friends. It wasn't just about practicing when she had time, it was becoming part of her everyday life. One evening, Lucy and Madison sat in a cafe, chatting over coffee. Lucy noticed that she wasn't thinking about the language at all anymore. She wasn't stressing about her grammar or trying to recall the right words. Instead, she was having a conversation, just like she would in her native language. It felt easy. The words came naturally. She didn't have to pause or think too hard. She simply spoke. It was the first time Lucy had truly felt like she was using English as a natural means of communication. Madison noticed the change, too. She smiled and said, "Wow, Lucy, you sound more natural already." Her words were full of pride. It felt good to hear that kind of encouragement, especially after so many days of hard work. Lucy grinned, feeling a sense of accomplishment. "I think I'm getting better at this," she replied. The excitement in her voice was evident. It was clear that Lucy had made real progress. The key to her improvement had been practice. Constant practice. It wasn't just about memorizing new words or studying grammar. It was about integrating English into her daily life and using it in real, practical situations. By listening and repeating, by mimicking the language in TV shows and podcasts, and by thinking directly in English, Lucy was slowly but surely improving her speaking skills. She had taken a giant step forward on her journey to fluency, but Lucy knew that this was only the beginning. The next step, she realized, was to start speaking with more people, more often. Real conversations with others would help her refine her skills and build even more confidence. She was ready to take on that challenge, knowing that every conversation, every sentence, and every mistake was another step toward becoming fluent. With every passing day, speaking English was no longer a task or a challenge for Lucy. It was starting to feel like a habit, something that came naturally with practice and determination. Lucy sat at the coffee shop, nervously twisting her cup in her hands. Her friend Madison had just introduced her to Brooke, a woman she had met through work. Madison was enthusiastic, eager to help Lucy with her English practice, but Lucy could feel the butterflies in her stomach as she prepared to speak with someone new. She had come a long way since the days when she used to freeze up at the thought of speaking in English. Now, after weeks of practicing and slowly building her confidence, Lucy was ready to take this next step. Madison had given her a gentle nudge, and now it was up to Lucy to see if she could handle a real conversation without hesitating. Brooke smiled warmly as she extended her hand. "Hi, Lucy. Nice to meet you," she said. Her voice was kind, and Lucy immediately felt a little more at ease. "Hi, Brooke. Nice to meet you, too," Lucy replied, shaking her hand. She felt the familiar nervousness rise up again. What if she said something wrong? What if Brooke didn't understand her? But she quickly remembered her rule. Don't think too much, just speak. The words began to flow a little more easily as she relaxed into the conversation. "So, what do you like to do for fun?" Brooke asked, leaning forward slightly. It was a simple question, but Lucy's heart skipped a beat. What if she didn't know the right way to answer? What if she couldn't express herself clearly? Lucy hesitated for a moment, but then, as if on autopilot, she reminded herself of the most important lesson she had learned so far. Just speak. She took a deep breath and let the words come out. "I like reading and watching movies, but now I also like practicing English," she said, her voice steady, though still tinged with a hint of nervousness. Brooke's face lit up with a smile. "That's great. You sound really good," she said, giving Lucy an encouraging thumbs up. Lucy felt a wave of relief wash over her. The fear that had been hanging over her just moments ago seemed to evaporate. She had spoken, and Brooke had understood her. There was no turning back now. "I'm still getting used to speaking without translating everything in my head," Lucy admitted, trying to explain the progress she had made. "But it's becoming easier. I've been trying to think in English even when I'm not speaking. It's helping a lot." Brooke nodded. "That's definitely the best way to do it. The more you practice, the more natural it will feel. "You're doing awesome!" Lucy smiled, feeling the weight of her self-doubt slowly lift. She realized that the more she spoke, the less she worried about making mistakes. Every time she had a conversation, no matter how simple, it became easier. She wasn't afraid of sounding foolish anymore. Instead, she felt proud that she was making progress. As they continued to chat, Lucy began to notice something amazing. She didn't have to pause and think about every single word she said. Her mind was starting to think in English without her even realizing it. When she spoke, the words just came to her, as if she were having a conversation in her native language. Brooke asked her more questions, and Lucy answered with increasing ease. At one point, Lucy even laughed at something Brooke said without thinking twice about how to respond. It was a small moment, but to Lucy, it felt like a huge victory. The conversation lasted longer than Lucy had expected, and by the end of it, she felt a newfound sense of confidence. She had been able to speak, without fear, to carry on a conversation without pausing to translate. And most importantly, she had enjoyed the conversation. The anxiety that used to hold her back had been replaced with excitement and energy. Lucy glanced at Madison, who was watching the conversation unfold with a proud smile. Madison had been right. Confidence wasn't about knowing every word or being perfect in grammar. It was about giving herself permission to speak, to try, and to make mistakes along the way. As they finished their coffee, Madison turned to Lucy. "See? I told you it would be fun once you started speaking without worrying so much. You've made amazing progress." Lucy smiled back at her, feeling a deep sense of gratitude. "Thank you for encouraging me. I never would have believed I could do it without your help." Brooke chimed in. "You've got this, Lucy. Keep practicing, and you'll be speaking English like a pro in no time." That night, as Lucy walked home, she reflected on the conversation. She realized how far she had come since she first began her journey with English. What had once been an intimidating challenge now felt like a natural part of her daily life. She knew that there was still much more to learn, but for the first time, she felt confident in her ability to keep improving. She had started to speak English with confidence, and that confidence was growing every day. Her next challenge, Lucy thought, would be to carry this newfound confidence into more conversations, to speak in different situations, and to practice even more. She was determined to keep going because she knew now that it was all about practicing, trying, and not being afraid of making mistakes. The more she practiced, the more confident she became. And the more confident she became, the more natural speaking English felt. It was no longer something she feared, but something she embraced. With this new attitude, Lucy knew she was ready to face her next big test, the final step in her English journey: fluent conversations in real-life situations. The thought excited her, and she couldn't wait to see how much further she could go. And so, Lucy's English learning journey continued. Every day brought new challenges, but with each challenge came new triumphs. Little by little she was, becoming the confident, fluent speaker she had always dreamed of being. Weeks passed since Lucy had made the decision to change how she approached speaking English. It hadn't been easy, but with each passing day she could feel herself becoming more and more comfortable with the language. She wasn't just memorizing words anymore or thinking about grammar rules. She was living the language. It was now part of her daily thoughts, part of her identity. One afternoon, Lucy found herself in a small coffee shop with a group of people she barely knew. They were discussing a new movie that had just been released, and Lucy, who had once been terrified to speak in front of others, now found herself jumping into the conversation without hesitation. She wasn't overthinking, trying to find the right words. She wasn't translating from her native language to English. She was simply speaking. Her sentences were flowing more naturally, and her confidence grew with every word she spoke. Madison, who was sitting next to her, gave her an amused smile as she quietly whispered, "Look at you! You're speaking fluently now." Lucy paused for a second and looked around the table. The group was engaged in the conversation, and nobody seemed to notice that Lucy had once struggled to speak. They were just listening, responding, and laughing, just as if she had always spoken with this level of fluency. It was an exhilarating feeling, one she hadn't experienced before. She smiled back at Madison, feeling a sense of accomplishment wash over her. "I guess I have," Lucy said softly, surprised at how naturally the words had come out. The old fears of making mistakes, of not being understood, seemed like distant memories. It wasn't perfect. She still occasionally stumbled over a word or had to pause to think of the right phrasing. But Lucy had learned something important during her journey. Speaking English well wasn't about being perfect. It was about taking risks, making mistakes, and learning from them. Every time she made a mistake, it didn't feel like a setback anymore. It felt like a step forward, an opportunity to improve. She remembered the countless hours spent practicing, sometimes in front of a mirror, sometimes with her headphones on while repeating lines from podcasts or TV shows. It was hard. Work, yes, but it was also rewarding. What she had learned along the way was that language wasn't just a set of rules, it was a tool for connection. The more she practiced, the more confident she became, and the more fluent she sounded. As the conversation continued in the coffee shop, Lucy began to realize just how far she had come. A year ago, she would have never imagined herself speaking so comfortably, let alone enjoying it. Back then, every conversation had felt like a test. But now, it felt more like a game. She wasn't focused on grammar or the fear of making errors anymore. She was focused on what the others were saying, on being part of the conversation, and most importantly, on expressing herself. She continued walking, thinking about how different she felt now. She wasn't scared of making mistakes anymore. It was a freeing realization. She was no longer held back by the fear of being misunderstood or making errors. In fact, mistakes had become part of the journey, just like they are in any learning process. Lucy had realized that learning English was not a destination. It was a continuous journey. Each day she had learned something new, whether it was a new word, a phrase, or a different way of expressing herself. And that was enough for her. She passed by the park, and as she glanced at the trees and the people jogging by, Lucy smiled. It was amazing how much she had transformed, and it wasn't just about speaking a new language, it was about feeling empowered. Speaking English had unlocked so many doors for her, both in her personal life and in her professional life. She had opened herself up to the world, and the more she practiced, the more she realized how much she could still grow. With each day, Lucy felt more confident and comfortable. And as she walked home that evening, she thought about the next steps. There was always more to learn, more to practice, and more to explore. The journey was far from over, and she was ready to continue. She knew that the secret to speaking English well wasn't about being perfect. It was about consistency, courage, and patience. It was about embracing the language in all its forms, its quirks, its challenges, and its beauty. And for Lucy, that meant thinking in English, speaking with confidence, and practicing every day, without fear of making mistakes. She had come a long way, but Lucy understood that this was only the beginning. The more she practiced, the better she would become. And soon, speaking English wouldn't just be a skill. It would be a part of her identity, something she could rely on wherever she went. Lucy paused for a moment and looked up at the sky. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life. If Lucy's story inspired you, it's time to take your own steps towards speaking English with confidence. Start practicing today. Think in English, speak without fear, and embrace the journey. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to English Tone for more tips and stories to help you on your language learning journey. Keep practicing, and we'll see you in the next video.